been working on recently. We just put the super on a couple of weeks ago, and it's great to see them now moving into the top of the hive, and we'll have a look at that now. Today we're actually going to be talking about securing your hive for extreme weather, but while we're here, let's just have a look at what this hive's doing. We just put this box straight on top, and you can already see the bees working on it, which is a great sign. We identified that the numbers in this hive were quite strong, and we either needed to take a split or add another box. So we decided to add another super, and here they are already waxing up all the little pieces. We didn't add any wax, we didn't do anything, we just put them on top and away they went. If you missed that one, that was a couple of weeks ago. So if you've got questions, put it in the comments below. Some of you might have seen on the news that our area, the east coast of Australia, has been smashed by really strong winds and a lot of coastal erosion. And we had 100 km/h winds, so 60 mile/h winds, and they were going for days. And I'm really happy to say the roofs of the hives stayed on, because it really does cop the brunt of the wind coming up the slope and trying to lift those roofs off. But these little wing screws worked a treat, and all of the roofs stayed on. Now, if you've got our classic hive, then the roof will probably blow off if you've got 100 km/h winds in your area. So I'll talk a little bit about what to do if you've got our classic hive or our Flow Hive too. Starting at the bottom of the hive, if you know there's some strong winds coming, then make sure you're on a solid footing, because if you've got wild weather, strong winds and rain, then if you've just got the feet straight on the earth, then you might find that especially a tall stack of hives will start sinking into the mud, and that could be the cause of your hive falling over. Now, so just a paver or a block of wood or anything under the hive, just to make sure it's really solid on its footing, and adjust these legs so that none of them are off the ground. They're there to be adjusted each corner so it's nice and stable. Once you've done that, you need to think about the hive in general. Now, if you've just put a super on top, like we have here, there's a chance that the bees might not have glued the parts together. So generally, it's amazing actually, and it's often a question people ask, is how come the boxes aren't secured together? And it's because the bees secure them together from the inside. And they do that with their propolis, their tree sap that they collect, and they glue it together quite nicely. Having said that, if you've only just put your hive together and there's a strong wind warning, then you'll need to strap your hive to make sure it's going to stay together while the bees are still doing their work, gluing the parts. And then coming to the roof of your hive, it's if you've got our Flow Hive too, as I was saying, these wing screws work quite nicely. You just do them up, and that secures your roof on. And we've tested that now with the 100 km/h winds up the slope here, and the roof stayed on. All the hives stayed there, which is fantastic. If you've got our classic hive, then you'll need a strap to hold your roof on, and that's simply going right around the hive like this. And you don't need to put an extreme amount of pressure in this case, a bit different to when you're moving a hive. When you're moving a hive, you take the roof off and you strap really hard with a couple of big straps to make sure your hive is going to stay together in transport. In this case, if you've got our classic hive, you don't have the wing screws, or if you've just newly put together your hive and you've got some strong winds, then you can just put a temporary strap right around. You don't want to make it too tight, just needs to be secure enough to hold the roof on and your boxes together. So one of these cam lock straps will do. Whereas if you are putting your hive on the back of a truck for transport, then you'll need to use those ratchet straps with the roof off. Okay, here we go. And it's a case of just putting a bit of pressure. The reason why you don't want too much pressure if you're strapping right around the roof like this is you don't want to snap off the edge of the shingle here. Any questions, put it in the comments. We might actually harvest a little bit of honey from this hive, because you can see there's some beautiful colours here in the window. And we'll do that just by getting our jar. It's all pretty wet and muddy at the moment. And we'll need our tube and key. And away we go. So if you find that this little cap is a bit tight to get out, sometimes they are, you can use the piece on the end of the tube just to flick it out like that. Little tip there. In goes the tube. Quick check to make sure there's not a whole lot of debris in that area. And then put the key in a little ways and give that a turn. And there we go, the honey's coming out. Beautiful. Look at that, it's already coming down the tube. It's a wonderful thing. Here we are on a day where you wouldn't normally harvest honey. It's a bit of a grey day, it's been raining. You certainly wouldn't want to be doing a whole lot of pulling the hives apart in the conventional fashion for harvesting on a day like today. The bees would be very unhappy about it, but they seem to be quite happy to be in the hive while we're harvesting in this way.
Morning everyone. It's so funny, last week we were dying from the heat and people were carrying on about the snow, and now we're in extreme weather here in Australia, but the hives are standing up well. A couple of people asking, Cedar, due to the weather, is that why we maybe paint our roofs instead of oiling them? Does it offer more protection in the wet, and especially with the snow as well?
It does. So the roof area cops the most weather. You've got the elements beating down on that, and I would certainly recommend putting a good coat of paint, and also getting a nice lot of paint in the joints here. You don't want water seeping into your roof, and you want to make sure your roof lasts as long as possible. So for that reason, even if you're oiling your hive like this one just here, you want to make sure you paint the roof. And I would actually recommend, this hive we haven't, but I'd actually recommend painting the underside of the roof as well. That just limits the expansion and contraction the wood normally does when it's subject to moisture changes.
Fantastic. We've got Rosemary's coming. She's in Godfrey's Creek in New South Wales. Had a mini tornado come through. Has the classic Flow Hive. Trees snapped in half, but could not believe it that the classic hive just did not budge.
That is incredible. That's a good story. Yeah, that's nice and lucky there. Sometimes you don't get so lucky. I've had a hive floating down a floodwater creek once, and that was simply from me not coming back to that hive and giving it a really good footing, and it actually toppled over, slid down the bank, and I had to fish it out of the floodwater, which was an interesting experience, but not so fun for the bees.
Cedar, Ty's asking, just wondering, he thinks he might need to encourage his bees to go up into the super. Any recommendations for that?
Yes, so the best recipe is lots of bees in the hive and a good nectar flow, but if that's not happening and you're getting impatient, then get your hive tool that comes with our suit and jacket kits, scrape off a bit of burr comb from on top of the brood box here, and just mash it into the side of the flow frames, and do that in the window. So you're basically just scraping off a bit of wax, and it might have a bit of honey with it as well, mashing it into the flow frame. And if you put it on the window side, you can enjoy watching them recycle that wax and repurpose it and start working on the flow frames that way. Might give you a little jump, but again, if you're not getting a good nectar flow and you don't have a strong colony, you still shouldn't be expecting a lot of action on your flow frames for some time.
Great. Cedar, just obviously with all this weather we've had, people's trays have been filling up with water. Is that okay, and what should they do? Should they just empty it, or obviously look out for hive beetles? What's your tips on that?
Yes, good point on the hive beetles. When we get wet and humid weather here in Australia, where we have lots of hive beetles, they do tend to love that kind of environment, nice and wet and humid. So good idea to clean out the tray, get rid of that water. It's when you've got a warm climate, the water in the tray isn't going to hurt your hive because it's existing outside of the hive, and it's because it's below. However, good idea to empty it out. It will get mucky, debris from the hive will fall through, and if it sits there with water, it'll start to smell bad. So you want to get that out, clean it out, and then trap some beetles, either using some cooking oil in the tray, or another thing you can do, we've been experimenting a bit with, is some detergent and water. It's a little less messy than cooking oil, a bit easier to clean. It's something that we're experimenting with and having good success with, so by all means give that a go as well, especially if you're in a warm climate. In the colder climates where you've got condensation issues and things, you might not want to have water sitting under your hive, so more of a hot climate thing.
Great. Cedar, in terms of ventilation, just with the oh, now what's it? The little the vent across in front of the tray.
Yes.
Which way should you have it to provide more ventilation for your hive, especially with this really humid weather we're having now in Australia?
Okay. That's I'll just show you in 1 second, but I better make sure this jar. There's lots of honey pouring out of this hive now, and here we go. Look at that. Beautiful. And if we wander over to this hive over here, what they're talking about is this vented cover down the bottom, and if we pull that out, it's got two ways of going, and I'll explain how the ventilation control works. So you've got your tray here, and what happens when you put your cover in and secure it with the L screws, the vented cover is sitting against this. Now if you've got the vents on the upside, air can flow through those vents up past this handle area under the screened bottom board and provide good ventilation. If you've got it the other way around, then we've designed it so it limits the ventilation. So this is sitting against there and there's no holes in the wood. So we've got a little ventilation going under your screen bottom board. And if you want to provide maximum ventilation, if your hive is really hot, they're bearding out the front, they're trying to allow some airflow in the hive, then you can take the tray out altogether and just allow maximum airflow underneath it. A couple of hive beetles here. Speaking of the hive beetles earlier, we're going to go through our hives at the moment in this hot, humid weather and catch some of those beetles using cooking oil, and we'll also try detergent and water.
And is it all right, Cedar, to leave that tray out for a while?
It is, it's fine to leave the tray out. Many people, especially in North America, tend to run screen bottom boards with no tray at all, and even in the snow, open meshed bottom boards. And thank you, Trace. We better change that jar.
Cedar is very busy this morning.
Okay. Look at that. Beautiful. Another nice jar of honey. I never get sick of looking at honey.
Cedar, can you oil the inside of the hive as well as the outside?
Look, you can. Generally, I like to the bees, but if you have a look at conventional beekeeping, beekeepers do all sorts of things to make their woodware last the longest. And they will actually dip the boxes in strong chemicals, a bit like they do with treated pine. Then they'll do several coats of probably the cheapest house paint you can find, because they're trying to maximise their operation, and they'll coat it inside and out, and the bees are fine with that. So once the bees are established, they will stay. I wouldn't oil the inside with a strong smelling oil and then put a swarm straight in there, or they might say, you know, this is a bit average, and take off and find a new home. So, but if you've got an already established hive, like installing a nuke, you can paint the inside. You can.
Great, Cedar. Who's it asking? Asking about whether they can add. Philip's asking, can he add an ideal size super with foundationless frames on top of his flow super so that they can get some honeycomb?
Certainly you can do that. So what they're talking about there is just adding another little small size bee box with some honeycomb collection frames. Wonderful thing to do. You can get some honeycomb from the edges of the brood box on a flow hive. You can also collect it under the lid here, and using some Tupperware containers upside down, pull the plug out of the inner cover, and you can collect honeycomb that way. But if you actually want to collect some nice honeycomb, perhaps you want to sell it to the local shops, then adding another box specifically for that could be a good idea.
Great. See, to Chuck Rao, who's one of our ambassadors, and maybe you don't know this answer to this one, wondering if there's going to be any more holiday bundles before Christmas.
Oh, well, we'll have to keep you posted on that one. So look out for your inbox, and make sure you check the comments on this post as well.
Great. Kip's asking, there's been a few fake pop-up Flow Hive ads popping up in people's feeds lately, and just sort of wondering the differences, I guess, in supporting and buying a Flow Hive as opposed to some of the fakes that are out there.
Yes, it's been an interesting journey from the beginning, with all sorts of fakes, all sorts of scams going on. Please beware, we've got one at the moment where they're offering cheap flow hives. There's one going on YouTube, and they actually won't ship you anything at all. They'll take your money and then sell your credit card details. So we're working hard to try and shut those down, even though it's you know, we're going a step further, but it's because they're targeting our product with that one. And I will need another jar here. We just don't want people doing that. I mean, they use pictures of my kids. It's terrible.
Oh my God.
So that there's been a long history of that, and you also get Chinese copies on the market as well. Please bear in mind that they are illegally manufactured and illegally sold, and you just don't know what you're getting when you're buying something like that. Oh, you don't get the support, you don't know whether it's going to work, you don't know the quality of it. I've certainly purchased some of those, tested them, and found that it wasn't even possible to get the honey out. So please be careful. And yeah, it's obviously not ideal to have those copies out there, but it's also a part of our world.
Yeah, exactly. See, funny you should say that. I had a phone call this morning about that very thing, about the YouTube one, someone in the States. So it's obviously all out there at the moment. Samantha's in Canada. Now she's wondering, she saw we put that second super on last week, and just wondering how the bees are going in it.
Great, we did just have a look at that, but let's have a look again. And you can see here, this is the second super, that they've started quite a strong colony. We've had a week of rain and wind, so we're not expecting them to fill the super in a week, but you can see here the little bits of recycled wax they're putting and joining the flow frame parts together. So you can see them in there. You can see them down in between the cell lines as well, working away. And if we have a look at the side window, we didn't add any wax to these at all. You can see they're in there doing their work, and there's plenty of bees, so that's fantastic.
How long, Cedar, do you think it would take before you would start to see honey in that second super?
If we had a really strong nectar flow right now, we would be starting to see honey already a couple of weeks in. And on an extreme case, you can actually get a whole box filled in a week, but the flowers have to be dripping to the ground with nectar, and your colony has to be bursting at the seams for that to happen. I know Stone holding the camera had that experience with his first hive, and it was certainly a great experience when that happens, but please don't think that that's going to happen every time. It's like any kind of agriculture, it depends on the season, it depends on the how many flowers there are producing nectar, and the strength of your colony. If you want to increase your chances, then run multiple hives. One hive can be doing extremely well while another is in a bit of a slow time as they get back on their feet. So it's always good to have more than one hive, and it'll increase your chances of getting that beautiful thing when the bees are filling it up so fast. You harvest all the honey and they refill it again within a week or two. That's amazing when that happens.
Great. This is a question we get asked quite a lot in customer support, Cedar, about painting your hives. Should you paint along like the edges of the boxes and also of the edges of the windows and the rear access cover?
Okay, so if you're painting a hive like this one here, then it is a good idea to, you can paint the inside and out if you want to. That will provide more protection. It depends on what you want to do. We're often suggesting just leave it natural wood for the bees, mimicking wood that they have evolved with living inside. One thing though, if you are painting all of the edges of these finger joints, just make sure the paint's not too thick, or you'll find that the door might jam a bit. And if it does happen, then just simply get out your craft knife and just slice it back nice and smooth, or some sandpaper, to make sure you get a good fitting door still. There is no rules. You can paint the inside and out, or you can not paint it at all. It's really up to you.
Fantastic. Cedar, a couple of people asking about the bees. What sort of bees work in a flow hive?
So these are Apis mellifera, which is the European honeybee that humans have dragged all around the world wherever they go, because they're such extreme honey producers and such amazing pollinators. A hive like this, when it's really full of bees, could pollinate 50 million flowers a day. There is no other species on the planet that can do that. And for that reason, they're incredibly, just getting one bee getting grumpy at me there. So the best thing to do is just to wander away when that happens. Lost my train of thought there.
Oh.
Okay. There it is there.
It's like, oh, okay. We're getting a lot of honey here. Sorry, Cedar's just having a little...
Just wandering away from one grumpy bee. Sometimes you get that, it's the genetics in the hive that determines whether they get grumpy, and also on grey rainy days they're a bit more grumpy as well, like this one.
Cedar, this is a question from someone in Melbourne. They added the super, had 2 full brood boxes in early November. They can see lots of bees in the frames, but they don't use a queen excluder. There's no honey in the frames at all. Do you know why that is? And should they be using the queen excluder?
So the queen excluder won't change that result. In fact, if anything, it'll slow it down a little bit, because there's a bit of a barrier between the 2 boxes. The recipe for getting a lot of honey is a lot of bees in the box and a good nectar flow. And until those 2 things coincide, it'll take some time before they will put honey in your flow super. So if you're getting a bit impatient, scrape some wax from the brood box, some burr comb that's on top of the frames, put it into the flow frame surface just with your hive tool. You won't damage it, and put it in the window of the hive so you can enjoy watching them recycle that wax and put it around. But they won't actually store any honey unless we're getting a good flow on, especially that first time when the bees are waxing all of the parts for the first time. After that, the flow frames will be treated just like any other sticky, they get called in conventional beekeeping, is when you've got a frame you've already harvested and they're sticky in the shed waiting to go back on again.
Great. Couple of questions versus the Flow Hive 2 and the Classic. Jeff's can see that we've added an extra super on the Flow Hive 2. Just wondering, can that also be done? Can you do the same thing on the Classic?
Absolutely. So we have those available, and it's a case, just like any conventional beekeeping, you can add more and more boxes if you want to. Different strategy there. If you want to run your hives smaller, you'll need to split more often, or if you want to run your hives bigger, then you can just keep adding more boxes as the colony expands. So it just depends on your management and also the region on where you are. If it's a very cold climate and you've got a very long winter ahead, then having another box full of honey will help your bees survive that winter. So that could be another reason to add either another brood box or another super.
Great. The other question, Cedar, is about the adjustable legs. Would they work on a classic hive?
So I believe we're making that available if you want to put the base right under your classic hive, but it would be a replacement for the whole base, not just the legs, because the classic doesn't have the structure. If you see how we've designed the base on this hive over here, it's almost as if we have another part of a box that we've shaped into a base, where a conventional beehive just has pretty much either a piece of tin underneath it or something like that, without all of this construction down here and the tray and the mesh, etc. Our classics are somewhere in between, with a much flatter profile base, some mesh and a simple core flute slider in it. So you won't be able to attach these legs to them, but you could replace the whole base section, and that would allow your ventilation control and your pest management tray to be added as well.
Great. Cedar, a question from Was a Poet, answering, just been getting a few bees, I think, wanting to the trough where the honey comes out. He's just wondering how the bees would be getting in there.
Oh, okay. So that's in this area here, Was a Poet's talking about. If you have a look in there, bees aren't supposed to be able to get in there, and there's two reasons why that could be happening. One is the cap may have been left off and some bees might have gone in there, and then you've put the cap back in and they're stuck in that zone. That's the most common reason, so it's a good idea to make sure these are put back. If you find they're getting in there some other way, then there is a problem with the frame and you need to contact support and we'll help you. Sometimes there could be a manufacturing error, allowing a gap big enough in the frame parts for bees to go through the cells and down into the trough area. So do get in touch and we'll help you work that out.
Fantastic. Cedar, you've got another jar, I think it's almost filling up there, but people asking, so you've got 6 jars out of that one frame. How much are those jars? I know they're 270 ml. How many kilos out of that one frame?
You get up to about 3 kilograms, sometimes more, sometimes a bit less, out of a full frame. And that's a lot of honey by anyone's standard for the kitchen table. So it's a wonderful thing. And then if you harvest all of these frames here, you'll have just about 50 jars of honey, which is incredible. And the beautiful thing is you get different colours and flavours from different frames. So I do really recommend harvesting honey to jars directly rather than putting all of the frames into a bucket. If you put them all into a bucket, it's like mixing all the flavours of your kitchen together, and you'll lose the floral notes of one versus the multi-tones of another.
Fantastic. Cedar, being asked, what do you recommend for a beginner beekeeper who lives in a residential area? Which hive?
So any of our hives are good, and it'll depend a little bit on your budget. So we've basically got more or less features, and then different wood types for you to consider. I better swap this jar here before it overflows. We don't want honey spilling in the apiary, or the bees will get very excited about that. We want to keep it nice and clean. If you do find the bees get excited about coming for the honey, you'll need to cover that jar with like a honeybee wrap or some kitchen wrap, and that will make sure that bees aren't coming to rob the honey. But in this case, the bees haven't really noticed at all that we're harvesting honey right behind the hive here. Some of you might notice the strap around the hive, which is a bit abnormal, And we were just explaining that in extreme weather, and we've had some extreme weather up to 100 km/h winds, if you've got the classic hive, it doesn't have the roof locks. So that's one way you could secure your classic hive, basically by putting ropes around it or a strap around it, or you could simply put some weights on the roof as well.
Great. Cedar VJC is asking, and this is not a joke, loves having birds in the garden, and just wondering if you're beekeeping, do the birds and the bees get along?
That's what you call getting along. We certainly there's types of birds that will eat bees, and from the bird's point of view, that's getting along just fine. We have the rainbow bee eaters come here, and they'll sit on top of the hives and they'll catch bees, but I figure fair's fair, you know. That's just a part of how everything works. But yeah, I haven't seen any issues with birds and bees apart from the odd eating of bees, which seems okay to me.
Cedar, Bee Nation's asking, what are your thoughts on a hive guardian? I don't know if that's like a step parent looking after the bees. I don't think so.
Might have to get a veil.
Oh, you okay?
Yeah, I'm good. I just might grab a veil. There's one on the fence here.
Okay. Cedar's just...
Yeah, I can keep answering questions.
Okay, he's just grabbing a veil. Cedar, just wondering about the hive guardian. They're plastic rectangles that go over the hive opening. And they're often used to keep the hive beetles out, to stop them walking over. Have you heard of them?
Plastic entrance to stop the hive beetles?
Yeah, they're called hive guardians.
Oh, okay. I don't know that one specifically. There's a lot of people experimenting with all sorts of things, which is fantastic, and let us know how you go. And I'm just grabbing a bee veil from that one annoying bee, which is getting a little territorial today, which is fair enough. It's been a very wild...
Oh, it is, Cedar. I think they're attracted to your hair and not the jar of honey.
Yes.
Okay, here we are back again. Cedar, do you have to replace the queen every once in a while, or do the virgin queens go out and then come back?
The commercial beekeepers do replace the queen, but it's not something you have to do. It's the reasons for doing it would be to make sure you're getting a very productive hive, and perhaps you're after genetics that are less swarmy. Maybe you've had problems with your bees swarming a lot. You could replace the queen for genetics that are less swarmy in effect, and or perhaps you've got an issue where the hive is just really dwindling down and the queen's not laying many eggs. She might be getting on. She can last up to 6 years, and that could be another reason if the colony is just really not building up in numbers, but other hives are. You might get in there and change the queen as well. But or another one is aggression. So if your hive's getting really aggressive, there's one aggressive here, not sure which one, we'll soon work it out when we start doing some beekeeping. And if you don't want that aggressive trait, if it's getting an issue for your family or neighbours, then you might like to get in there and replace the queen with some nice, quiet, gentle genetics, and that'll be a joy to have in your backyard compared to one that's a bit territorial. So it is a bit of a task getting into a hive, especially if reasons. So you might like to get some help from an experienced beekeeper to do that.
Great. Cedar, Alan from Harvey Bay is just wondering, do ants ever pose a problem, and could you just put a little water container under each of those adjustable feet to maybe stop the ants?
You could. So ants are a cosmetic issue. They can get behind these covers and just be a bit annoying, but they're not actually going to bother your hive or your bees. However, there's a few things you can do, and one of them is simply add a little bit of grease to these leg bolts if you've got the Flow Hive too. But as said, you could make a little water container, and you see people using all sorts of things like that, and that could provide an ant barrier as well. If you are making an ant barrier, whether you're greasing these bolts or using a water or oil trap, then you'll need to make sure the foliage isn't touching your hive, because it won't work. If, like this, you've got a leaf touching the hive, the ants will simply use that as a pathway to get onto your hive. So it'll be a case of clearing around a little bit, then adding whatever ant barrier you like. You can actually dust a little bit of cinnamon powder behind the covers as well, and that'll be a bit of a deterrent. You'll probably have to brush ants off to get rid of them, and then they probably won't bother you again for some time.
Great. Jem's asking, do you ever need to filter the honey once you've extracted it from the Flow Hive?
Not really. If you did notice some debris coming out, perhaps there was some debris built up in this trough area, then you could filter it, but I'd have to say I never filter the honey. It just comes out perfectly good, ready for the table, and there really is no debris in there. And if there was, it'd probably just be some little bits of wax that would float to the top anyway, and not really an issue. What you're seeing on the surface there is actually little bubbles created by the honey stream falling into the jar. It's perfectly clear. So it's amazing how well it works actually. It was a real win, because filtering honey is another task that I'm so glad I don't have to do anymore.
Fantastic. Cedar, Caleb's asking, what is the oldest Flow Hive that you have?
Okay, that's a great question. I've actually still got some prototype hives in my apiary, and I've kept them there just for memorabilia's sake, but also just to see how they go. So even before the pre-production models that we were testing out is some prototypes in my apiary. So that would be, they're still there from 2014, 2013, so that would be the oldest we've got. So in essence, this is still a very new way to harvest honey, and so we don't have hives that are 10 years, 20 years old yet, but I'm hoping we will as time goes on.
Great. Cedar, Helga's got a question. She's harvested honey from her frames and found some small hive beetle larvae in the honey. Wanting to know a couple of things. Has this ever happened to you? She'd had a bit of a weaker colony. There'd been a problem with the queen. That's since been resolved. But now she's wondering, does she need to pull out and clean those flow frames?
Okay, so sometimes you can get hive beetle attack, and it sounds like you're on top of it and your bees are okay. But the first thing to do, if you notice that there's hive beetle larvae in the honey which look like little tiny maggots, is check that your hive's actually okay in the brood nest. So you'll want to get in there and make sure that you're not getting what's called a slime out, where beetles take over, they lay lots of eggs in the frames, and it all turns into one sticky, slimy mess. And if that happens, then there's a few things you want to do straight away. You might be able to save the colony by getting rid of the honey and pollen on the edges and just reducing it down to just a couple of brood frames in the centre for the bees to manage, because in the end, hive beetles are an opportunist. They just take over when there's some kind of other problem going on. And usually when the bee numbers are low and there's a whole big hive to look after, and they can't get over all of the frames to stop the beetles laying their eggs. Now, once you've done that and you've just got a couple of frames for them to look after in the middle, that will really increase their chances of survival. That honey and pollen, take that away, replace it with blank frames, or if you're using naturally drawn comb, you can just simply cut it out and put the frame back in again, and take that away, drown it if it's got maggots in it, keep it underwater for a few days, or put it in a freezer for 3 days is another good way to manage those hive beetles. But you've got to get on top of it. If you're seeing a whole lot of little hive beetle larvae in the jar, you might have a bigger problem. Sounds like you're on top of it, which is fantastic. Then the next question is, do you need to clean the frames? The answer is probably not, unless you're opening the windows and seeing a big slime out. If you're just seen a few larvae in your jar, then the bees will manage that okay if the colony is strong enough. But if the colony is weak and you're not seeing lots in the windows when you take the covers off, then take the whole super off, reduce that size of that colony, and if you can, put those frames in a freezer, and that if you do that for more than 3 days, it'll kill the hive beetle eggs. And as your colony gets stronger, you can put that super back on again and away they go. So a few tips there. We've got more videos at thebeekeeper.org if you want some in-depth training material. We have a fantastic course there with experts from all over the world contributing to that.
Great. Yeah, a few questions coming in about the hive beetle. Cedar, one is in regards to that, the other question previously with the larvae, could you eat that honey?
It's a bit like the tequila worm, you know, in the bottom of the bottle you get the... Look, it's up to you to judge, but you can probably just wait for them to float to the top, skim it off, just check the honey's not affected and fermented. If the honey still tastes good, I would eat it, but that's up to you.
Great. Cedar, also the oil now for the Flow Hive 2 that people are putting in their trays, how long should they leave the oil there for?
So you'd want to clean it out probably monthly if you're catching hive beetles, just because a whole lot of debris builds up and it tends to get a bit grimy. So get your hive tool, scrape it out, put some fresh oil and put it back in again. And that way you can be trapping lots of hive beetles and limiting the numbers that are around. At my place, the hive right near my house gets affected the most because they really breed up in our compost heap. So we've got one of those closed composting containers and the hive beetles just go crazy in there. So we're switching over to a sub pod which will help that situation without that kind of wet, dank environment that hive beetles tend to love inside those typical plastic compost containers.
Great. A good question from Trent, new beginner beekeeper, and it's a really common question. If they purchase a Flow Hive, do they have to find bees or buy them, or will they just fly into the hive?
So that is a common question, as you say, and there's no such thing as a silly question, so thanks for asking. Now, the answer is very rarely they might do that, but that's a method called a bait hive, where you specifically set up a hive near other hives, hoping for a swarm to go, wow, that's a great new home, and I'll move right in. And while that happens sometimes, I certainly wouldn't be banking on it. So what you need to do in order to install your bees is to order either a nucleus, which is a small starter hive, and you can pick up that from a beekeeper, or order a package, which is the bees and a queen bee in a little cage that can come in the mail. I know, crazy, right? A few thousand bees in a box in the mail, and but anyway, that's the way it's done. And you can shake those bees into your brood box, put the little queen in there, look after them, and they'll grow. And the other methods are you can catch a swarm and shake them in. We've got videos of all of this at thebeekeeper.org, and you can find out the many ways to start a hive. Well, a great way, if you've got a friend keeping bees, is to take a split, and you'll actually be helping them in the springtime by reducing the numbers so their hive is less likely to swarm.
Great. This is another one of those great questions of how global our beekeeping family is. Phil's from Ontario, Canada, had 12 inches of snow dumped on them last night.
Wow.
But has had really great success with cinnamon and keeping ants away from their hives in Canada.
Okay, good tip there. Cinnamon powder, dust it behind here, and you'll find that the ants just don't like it very much.
Exactly. Cedar, and talking about people obviously in Canada and freezing cold climates, completely opposite to us, do they need to insulate their hives?
So it's a much debated topic, the insulation of hives. Some beekeepers certainly do go for insulation, and they might wrap their hive for the winter time, and also put some, perhaps use some styrofoam from an old poly box under the roof here to add some more insulation there. Other beekeepers say no, they're fine just as they are. You can have an open mesh bottom board, you can dig it out of knee-deep snow and your bees are fine. So it's really up to you to decide what you want to do. There's said to be pros and cons of insulating and not insulating. One is, in those extreme colds, the bees are actually going into a mode which makes them last a long time. They're really slowing down and forming a ball. Whereas if the hive is warmer, perhaps they might use a little bit more honey. There's all sorts of arguments, and I'm no expert in this, so if you have some good information on it, chime in on the thread. It's all about helping people answer their questions. So if you've got information on that one or anything else on the thread, jump in there and help people.
Yeah, it's great seeing so many people answering everybody's questions. Cedar, you'll be out of a job soon.
That's right.
Danny in the UK is just wondering, what are the different types of wood that we use in the Flow Hive, and also what is it that you call the super?
Okay. The super is a word for a box for collecting honey. So it's a fancy word, so that's called the Flow Super. But if it was a conventional box with wood and wax frames, it would just be called a super. And this is the brood box here because that's where the bees, the queen's laying thousands of eggs and they're raising their broods. So that gets called a brood box, and this gets called a super. The next part of the question was?
Oh, the different types of timber, Cedar.
So this is cedar, and it's a very durable wood. It's very popular in North America as the best wood you can use for a hive. So it has properties in it that resist rot, resist mildew. Now, it's the type of wood that you can oil like this and have good success keeping it oiled, provided you keep up a bit of TLC every 6 to 12 months to give it a bit of rub back and another coat of oil. However, if you're using the other wood types we offer, then we would recommend painting them. So we have the Araucaria and the Paulownia as well, and like this one here, that is a painted hive. Now, if you don't paint them, they'll look good for 4 or 5 months or so, and then the mildew will set in and it just won't look as good. The mildew won't hurt your hive, it's just more of an aesthetic thing. So if you decided to go for the oiled look on one of our other wood types and it's starting to get a lot of mildew, you can change tactics and then paint it, bring your hive back to looking good, and protecting your hive and giving it a bit of TLC will make it last longer as well.
Great. VJC is asking another question there. He's in Naples in Italy, and he's trying to convince his wife that they should put a hive in their little garden in Italy, but she keeps saying she's allergic. He has his doubts. Not that we're getting involved in relationships here, Cedar. What advice would you like to give him so that he can convince his wife to get a hive?
I see. That's going to be a discussion for your family to have. I'm certainly not going to say one way or another. Some people do have really severe allergic reactions, and that is serious. We do have first aid links on our websites that can be a bit odd if it's on your face, but it goes away again. But so if it's that kind of reaction, then it's something you may or may not want to increase the chances of. Of course, you can get stung by bees without having hives as well. But having a hive around will increase the chances. So good luck deciding on whether you want to keep hives or not. The type of, the genetics of the queen will affect your experience as well. So if you do go ahead, make sure you go to a queen breeder and ask for a very gentle, placid hive. and it really is a big difference between one that's more territorial.
To Cedar, by the way. Chris is asking, just wondering about our apiary, do we have different genetic lineages of bees, or are they all from the original hive that's been split over the years?
Okay, there's a bit of a mixture here. Sometimes we buy in queens, sometimes we take splits and let them raise their own queens. And when we buy queens, it's generally what we can get. So they might be Italians, or they might be Caucasians, or they might be Carnolians. And all of these are breeds of bees that are said to have different traits. The Italians are supposed to be a good starter bee, whatever that means, and you hear these raves like this. For me, it's a lot more I guess, because the queen tends to mate with a lot of drones, up to 30 or more, you're getting all of that genetic material into your hive, and your hive will more often than not be a bit of a mixture, unless you've got a queen that's been artificially inseminated by the breeder. So yeah, it's just a bit of a mixture here in our apiary, and I haven't found a great deal of difference between the different breeds, but I have found hives that are aggressive and hives that are not. That's the main one when you're starting out. You want a nice, gentle breed, which just is a pleasure to be around and work with.
Cedar, do you still need all the safety gear, the bee suit, the smoker when setting up a flow hive?
Absolutely. So if you're getting your first kit, then grab one of our bundles which has your bee suit, your smoker, your hive tool and your hive, and that's your basic kit, and you'll need that when you install your bees and you do your brood inspections. If you want to have a hive in your yard and not do the brood inspections, you'll need to get somebody else to do it. So you'll need to get a service agreement with a local beekeeper who can come and manage your hive and make sure it's happy and healthy. However, what most people find is, even if they start out that way, they start enjoying the learning process of learning about their bees, and before you know it, you're in there marvelling at the wonderful world of bees in the brood box as they build their comb, as they grow their hive, as they collect their pollen and make their honey.
Great. Cedar, Karen's in South Gippsland, so that's quite south of in Victoria here in Australia. Caught a swarm about 12 months ago. They're all in the brood box. She's put the queen excluder on, added the super, but they're still not going up into the super. Any suggestions or tips on what she should do?
Okay, so sometimes that can take a while and it's a bit frustrating. The recipe is you want a lot of bees, so when you open the side windows, you're seeing that the hive is packed with bees, and when you open the side windows, there's lots of bees. When that coincides with a good nectar flow, you'll get fast action. But until that happens, it will be quite slow. But one tip is scrape some burr comb off the brood box, mash it into the flow frame surface. You won't damage the flow frames. Put that on the window side and enjoy watching the bees recycle that as they start waxing up the flow frames for the first time. That might increase it, but you probably won't get a lot of honey storage till those bee numbers really build up. So that's a couple of tips there. Some beekeepers, especially experienced ones, tend to do things like move frames up from the bottom and intermingle them with flow frames, etc. I haven't found that helps. I'd recommend just letting your bees breed up to the point where they're ready to start storing honey.
Great. Cedar, another question. In winter time, where do the bees just stay in the hive, or what do they do?
So here in this subtropical region, the bees are foraging winter, summer, all year round, and we can harvest all year round as well. So it really depends where you are. But if you're in a cold climate that gets a long cold winter with snow, etc., then yes, your bees are going to go into a mode where they actually they get organised. They even start making what's called fat bees that are a bit bigger in their fat body and can last a bit longer. They will reduce the size of their colony, and they'll form a tight ball to keep warm, to power themselves, keep themselves going, to keep themselves warm. So yes, they will stay in the hive for the most part, but they'll wait till the weather's more favourable, and they don't actually defecate in the hive. They will fly out of the hive to do that. So as soon as you get a vaguely warmer day that's nice for flight, those bees will fly out, go to the toilet and come back again.
Cedar, Matthew's wanting to know, on a really hot night, summer's night at your place, would you leave the tray out overnight?
You certainly can. I don't tend to. I just put the vented cover with vents up. I'll do that now on this one. You can see I've got the vents facing down, and that's limiting ventilation. But because we're in this warmer time, I'm going to spin that around like that, put the vents on the upper side, and that will increase ventilation. If you've got a massive heat wave, perhaps pull the tray out altogether. But bees are incredibly robust. I guess the only time you're going to have a real problem is if your hives are in full sun and you've got an extreme heat wave afternoon. And you do hear of colonies actually melting down when the temperature inside the hive gets above the wax melting point of 63 degrees C. So that's extreme. I've heard of that happening on a rooftop. And that was in a heat wave. A friend of mine had their hives in all hives without the ventilation in the board, and it got so hot up there that they were sitting inside at the kitchen table and honey started dripping down the light fitting and onto the table, and it was a mess on the roof with all of the wax and honey melting out of the hives and flowing down the roof. Not good. So you can get issues like that, but mostly bees are incredible at air conditioning their hives, and if you can provide some afternoon shade in those hotter months, then that's fantastic as well. Try and position it so you get afternoon shade on your hive in summer, and your bees will be very happy. Having said that, a lot of commercial beekeepers and us down here in the road, there's no shade on those hives all year round, and the bees are fine.
Great. Cedar, last questions, and I think it may be from someone from beautiful New Zealand, where I am from. Wondering, can you use the Flow Hive for the Manuka honey?
So is yes, but if you get 100% Manuka, or around here we've got another one called jellybush, which is similar, and it's got that thixotropic property where if you put it in a jar, it'll set, and you take the lid off and turn it up. It sets like a jelly, and if that's the case, it won't come out of the flow frames, and it won't come out of conventional frames either. And what beekeepers do when they get a high content of that thixotropic honey is they take the frames out and they prick down the cells, and then they centrifuge the honey, and the act of pricking that honey, or giving it a little stir, I guess, turns it liquid, or more liquid, for a short amount of time, enough time to get it out of the frames. So it's unusual. Around here we have those species, and you'll see globules coming out of the hive, and as long as it's a bit of a mix, it's fine. But if you're specifically going after that and trying to get 100%, you might have trouble where the thixotropic honey will not come out of your flow frames.
Great.
Thank you very much for all your questions. Have you got one more?
All good.
Okay. If you've got more, you can keep putting them in the comments below. Also let us know what you'd like us to cover next week. The idea is we answer your questions, and we make it easier to get started in the fascinating world of bees. And it's only when we look after our colonies that we get this beautiful reward of honey. Also, if you're just starting out, have a look at thebeekeeper.org, and there we have in-depth training material to take you from square one to a deep scientific knowledge of beekeeping.